Hi, I'm Gord Carlsey. I'm curator of the Fort Garry Horse Museum and Archives here in Winnipeg. Our first panel in the museum talks about the formation of the regiment. So the Fort Garry Horse was formed on April 15th, 1912. Prior to that, there were no militia cavalry in Winnipeg. We had the unit called the 18th Mounted Rifles. Now, mounted rifles operate on horseback, but they're intended to do their fighting on foot. This is much like the Boers in the South African War, which we copied. But it was intended that there should be a cavalry unit, and cavalry operate on horseback, primarily staying, and their actual main weapon is the sword, using a rifle as a secondary weapon when they are dismounted. So Major Patterson of the 18th Mounted Rifles petitioned the Militia Department, which is now the Department of National Defense, saying that there should be a cavalry unit in Winnipeg. And then that cavalry unit was formed, as I mentioned, on April 15th, 1912, and immediately went into training in the summer camp of the year 1912. The first rifle issued to the Fort Garry Horse in 1912 was the Long Lee Enfield Mark I. This was the same rifle Canadian forces used in the South African or Boer War, and it was developed in the 1890s, a very successful rifle. However, it was carried a 10-round magazine, but it still had to be loaded with individual rounds, so it was not quick to reload like the Mausers, for example, that the Boers used in the South African War. However, it was soon to be replaced by a Canadian-designed rifle called the Ross rifle. So in our uniform room, we have a number of uniforms on display. One of our earliest ones is this officer's tunic from 1912. So this is what they would be wearing when the regiment was formed. They wore a scarlet woolen tunic with brown breeches with a black stripe to indicate they were cavalry. The officers wore the Sam Brown belt, whereas the other ranks would wear a bandolier for the ammunition for their rifle. When the First World War began in August of 1914, the Canadian Army initially mobilized, and the Fort Garry Horse became part of what was called the 6th Battalion Canadian Expeditionary Force. So the existing militia structure did not mobilize as such. New battalions were created, and the militia units filled in those ranks. The 6th Battalion was actually an infantry battalion, and it was formed from several units around Winnipeg and in Manitoba, which came together, most of them cavalry units, and thus they formed that 6th Battalion. They went overseas on a ship called the SS Lapland and began their training in England in Salisbury Plain in late 1914. On the panel here, we also have the Ross Rifle Mark III. This was a Canadian design and built rifle designed by Sir Charles Ross. The Fort Garry Horse was equipped with two versions of the Ross rifle prior to the First World War. First, the Ross Rifle Mark II, and then the Mark III just at the beginning of the First World War when the unit was mobilized. The Ross rifle was based on a hunting rifle. It was a very accurate piece. However, it didn't fare well in the trenches, wasn't able to handle poor quality ammunition or large quantities of dirt, and it was ultimately replaced in the Canadian Army by 1916. This is regimental mess dress circa 1912-1913. The regimental facing color is yellow, so a normal mess dress at that time was scarlet, as this is, with yellow facings, which is the regiment specific. And this type of mess dress was worn right through into the 1950s until we changed to a different type, and we've now gone full circle, and this is now still regimental mess dress. It's still worn over 100 years later. So the 6th Battalion, quote, Fort Garry's mixed unit, arrived in Salisbury Plain in England and did their initial infantry training. However, in January 1915, it was determined that Canada did in fact need cavalry, and our two regular cavalry regiments, Lord Strathcona's Horse Royal Canadians and the Royal Canadian Dragoons, were sent over to France. They needed a depot unit to maintain recruits and maintain reinforcements for those, so the 6th Battalion was converted to the Canadian Cavalry Depot, still wearing their 6th Battalion badge. But now the men who had been cavalry before went to infantry and went back into cavalry. The next rifle is the one that replaced the Ross rifle in service and stayed in service till 1942 in Canada. It was the SMLE, or Short Magazine Lee Enfield. It was an improvement over the Mark I Lee Enfield of the South African War in that it could be charger loaded with 5-round charger clips, so it was very quick to reload. It had a strengthened barrel and a strengthened fitting for the bayonet mounting. It was actually quite a bit shorter, even though it looks fairly long compared to modern rifles, but saw extensive use, and some of these are still in use around the world today. This is our 1916 panel. So in February of 1916, the Garrys moved from, actually they were converted from the Canadian Cavalry Depot, renamed again the Fort Garry Horse, and now a full cavalry regiment back with its original name were sent off to France. They joined with the other units of the Canadian Cavalry Brigade, being the Royal Canadian Dragoons and Lord Strathcona's Horse Royal Canadians. being the 3rd Regiment in the Canadian Cavalry Brigade. The first action was the Battle of the Somme in July 1916, where the cavalry were intended to support the infantry by placing bridges over the trenches and so on that the infantry had captured. These were portable bridges that could actually be carried on horseback and erected very quickly to allow artillery and heavy wagons and so on to follow on. However, the initial attack in July 1916, the Battle of the Somme, did not achieve its full objectives. They were slowed down, so the bridges were never actually used. But this was our first taste of action. As well, we were doing several patrols in the area, so the men did see some action at that time. This weapon is a Maschinengewehr 0815, so a 1908 machine gun, 1915 modification. It was a modification of the general German machine gun to make it lighter, so it could be actually carried by one man and fired from the hip if necessary, even though it was quite heavy. Still a water-cooled gun. It fired from a belt of ammunition, about 220 rounds in the belt, and fired about 500 to 600 rounds per minute. Here we have a full-size diorama of a small section of a trench on the Western Front. Though we were cavalry, we did spend some time in the trenches. When the cavalry were not needed, they would dismount 1 or 3/4 of the men, and those men would go forward into the trenches. The last quarter of the men had to take care of the horses. So in our trench here, we have things called duck boards, which are on the ground that help keep you off the mud. There's photographs and images around showing actual trenches. We show what's called a fire step, which is something you would stand up on to fire over the top of the trench. We have an original First World War entrenching tool, which the visitors can handle, as well as a homemade periscope. And behind me are some barbed wire stakes, actually from the First World War, that were screwed into the ground, and a special metal bucket, which is used as a latrine or toilet. So this is our 1917 panel. In 1917, the Fort Garry Horse was involved in a major mounted action. The Germans, to straighten out their lines, withdrew rapidly, and the object of the Allies was to keep up with them to prevent them from digging in. They withdrew to a prepared position called the Hindenburg Line. So the cavalry moved ahead of the infantry, fighting the Germans, keeping them on the back foot, and we were involved in 2 major actions in the villages of Guillancourt and Salcourt in France. And shortly after that, they were dismounted and they were involved in trench raids, raiding the German trenches. One of our officers, Lieutenant Harcus, Strachan, won the Military Cross in one of the trench raids at a place called Max Wood, and we'll hear more about him later. This is the typical rifle of the German soldier, the Gewehr 98. It had a 5-round ammunition or 5-round magazine. It was a very modern, solidly built rifle, fired at 8mm Mauser rounds, and a very similar version of it served into the Second World War with the German Army. And much like with the British Army, they shortened it or modernized it somewhat, but it's still a very solid rifle, and the basic action of the Gewehr 98 is still in use in many hunting rifles today. This panel is a bit of a side story, and most Winnipeggers know this, but the famous character Winnie the Pooh has a connection with Winnipeg, and in addition a connection with our regiment, the Fort Garry Horse. So when the unit was being mobilized as the 6th Battalion Canadian Expeditionary Force, our veterinary officer, Harry Colburn, was being sent out east to Camp Valcartier with all the other veterinarians. At a stop in White River, Ontario, he bought from a hunter a bear cub as a pet. You could do that then. And he took that pet with him to Valcartier, where he became a favorite of the troops and became the mascot of the veterinary section that was located at Valcartier. He called the bear Winnipeg, or Winnie for short, and Winnie was taken overseas to England along with Harry Colburn and lived on Salisbury Plain for a while. But when Harry realized he was being sent to France, he knew that was no place for a bear, so he took the bear to the London Zoo, and the bear was left there to grow up and be part of the London Zoo, and very popular with children, known as Winnie. Years after the war, A.A. Milne, the author, took his son, Christopher Robin Milne, to the zoo to see the bear, and Christopher Robin nicknamed the bear Pooh. Therefore, we have Winnie the Pooh, and A.A. Milne wrote the story, The Tales of Winnie the Pooh, based on his son's experience. This is our second panel in the year 1917. You'll recall I mentioned Lieutenant Harcus Strachan winning a Victoria Cross in March of 1917. Well, in November of that same year, the Garrys were involved in one of the major battles of the First World War. It was the first major tank attack. And no, we weren't in tanks at that time. We were still horse cavalry. The British used a large number of tanks at the Battle of Cambrai on 20th of November 1917 to attack the German Hindenburg Line. The idea was to break through them with tanks. Following the tanks would be the infantry, and particularly the cavalry, who were now free of the trenches and barbed wire and could advance rapidly into the German rear area. And this was the task of the Fort Garry Horse. They were supposed to cross behind the tanks, cross a canal and a river, and go around the entire battle and capture the German headquarters in the rear area north of the city of Cambrai. Well, things, as often in war, didn't go as planned. The tank that was supposed to lead them across a bridge fell through the bridge, destroying it, so the cavalry couldn't cross there. So Lieutenant Harcus Strachan and his squadron moved east. They found a disused lock gate, started to build a bridge across the lock using various logs and wood they found around to get the horses across. During that time, Captain Campbell, who was in charge of the squadron, was killed. So Lieutenant Strachan, being second in command, took over and led his unit across the temporary bridge. Once they got across in open ground, they found a German artillery battery that had been shelling our positions. They drew swords and charged the battery, killing all the gunners and putting the battery out of action. From there on, they continued to move forward. However, the Germans realized by this time that there was nobody behind them. The cavalry operation had actually been canceled, and there was no way to call them back. So they were now surrounded by German troops, firing at them from all sides. They led the horses and men into a sunken road to get some protection, waited until dark, and then the men broke into two groups and found their way back on foot. And for his bravery, Lieutenant Harcus Strachan was awarded the Victoria Cross, which we have here in the museum, as well as his second in command was awarded the Military Cross for this action. There are two artifacts on this panel. At the top, we have the 1908 pattern cavalry sword. This was the last sword designed in the British organizations for military use, and it's a direct thrusting sword. Unlike all previous swords, which are called cut and thrust, which had sharp, long, curved blades, this has a very straight blade, only sharp at the tip, and was used for direct thrusting or direct pointing. And this was the type carried by the Canadian cavalry throughout the First World War. The other small item actually belonged to Harcus Strachan, and it's a pocket barometer. You couldn't look up the weather channel, so you just had to use your own equipment to look at see if the air pressure was rising or falling to try and work out the weather. These are the medals of later Lieutenant Colonel Harcus Strachan, who won his Victoria Cross and his Military Cross during the First World War. Those are the first two medals in the medal group, followed by his First World War campaign medals. He lived to serve into the Second World War, became a lieutenant colonel, and raised the Edmonton Fusilier Regiment, which he took overseas to England. However, he was too old for frontline service by this time, so he came home to Canada to sell war bonds before his retirement. However, as a winner of the Victoria Cross, you automatically received coronation medals, centennial medals, commemorative medals of that type, and those are all there in his medal group. This is our first panel in the year 1918. The Garrys were involved in mounted and dismounted action through that time. The Germans made a major advance on the 21st of March 1918, and it was held back ultimately by the Canadian cavalry, who were situated between the British Army and the French Army. And the Garrys were involved in the battles of Armoury Wood on 30 March of 1918, and the battles of Rifle Wood, which is a dismounted battle, on the 1st of April 1918. And we have descriptions and maps of those battles describing the significance to the regiment. This is our second panel in the year 1918, and the subtitle is The 100 Days. So on August 8th, 1918, there was a major advance led by the Canadian and Australian Corps, which essentially started pushed the retreat of the German army and led to the end of the war, essentially 100 days later on November 11th, 1918. So we were initially in action, mounted, working alongside the infantry and also alongside the tanks. They used tanks, infantry, and cavalry together. By October, we were involved in many rapid actions at a place particularly called Gatineau Wood. One of our members, Lieutenant Dunwoody, had won the Distinguished Conduct Medal, and he also won the Distinguished Service Order, which we have on display elsewhere in our museum. So this is an interesting firearm in our collection. It's actually not military, however it was captured in military contents. This is a German type of rifle called a Schützen, and this is used for a special type of sports shooting that is popular in Germany. The rifles are custom made and custom fitted to their owner. During the 100 days, we managed to capture a German Corps headquarters, which contained a lot of officers' maps and also their private firearms, which they used for this type of sports shooting. We have several in the collection, and this is the one in the best condition, so we put it on display. When the armistice was declared on November 11th, 1918, the Fort Garry Horse started to move east and for a time performed garrison duty in Germany. And eventually they were sent home near 1919. It took quite a while to get them out of Germany, back through France, back into England, where they waited a long time for the ships to bring them home. They came home on two ships, the Northland being one of them and the Carmania the other. and they happened to arrive back in Winnipeg right in the middle of the famous Winnipeg General Strike in June 1919. The unit was quickly demobilized. However, some soldiers elected to stay on to assist with suppressing of the strike. Other ones had already gotten out, were out of uniform, but joined up what was called the Specials in order to also help suppress the strike. And some may well have been strikers once they got out of uniform, because a lot of former soldiers were sympathetic with the strikers. This panel, titled the year 1920, so now the regiment is now going back to a part-time status. It was essentially disbanded from its wartime full-time status and reorganized as part of the Canadian Militia. The pre-war term, the 34th Fort Garry Horse, was no longer used. It was simply called the Fort Garry Horse, basically combining the traditions of the pre-war militia regiment and the overseas regiment that had served from 1914 to 1918. Also, this panel continues on into the 1930s. We talk about 1936, when due to a reduction in the size of the militia, the Fort Garry Horse was amalgamated with a unit called the Manitoba Horse, and that took in battle honors actually from the Northwest Rebellion, which is how we have that connection of our unit, even though we were formed in 1912, with a unit from 1885. These panels at the entrance to our museum, also done in the 1990s, so they're due to be upgraded, cover the Northwest Rebellion of 1885. Now, even though the Fort Garry Horse was formed in 1912, we perpetuate a unit called Bolton's Mounted Infantry that served in that conflict in the summer of 1885. So we have here pictures of some of the key players, General Middleton, Gabriel Dumont, the maps showing where Bolton's Mounted Infantry served and where the other columns of the Northwest Rebellion served. So we carry 3 battle honors. We carry Northwest Rebellion 1885, battle honors to the Battle of Fish Creek and the battles of Batoche as part of our history. This is our horse and rider diorama. It shows the typical uniform worn by a cavalryman during the First World War. It includes things like the leather bandolier over the shoulder, which carries the ammunition for the Lee Enfield rifle, the respirator or gas mask, which is carried in a pouch on the back. He wears a leather jerkin, which is often used for warmth instead of the heavy woolen greatcoats that kept your corps warm. The horse is equipped as they would have been during that time. They have a bandolier of ammunition around the horse's neck, which is used when the man is dismounted. It's taken off the horse and it gives him extra ammunition. On the saddle at the back, you'll see a greatcoat rolled up and a blanket inside that, and then there's a waterproof sheet. This is what the soldier would live under with the equipment carried on the saddle. The sword is held on the left side, or what was called the near side of the saddle, and the rifle is in a bucket on the right side or the off side of the saddle. And there's also a round circular mess tin where the soldier would prepare their food inside. So a lot of the equipment used to take care of the horse, farrier's equipment to take care of their hooves and other items are here on display. We also have some hands-on items in this area of the cavalryman. For example, this deactivated #1 Lee Enfield rifle, or a short magazine Lee Enfield. So we use this to demonstrate the bolt action, how it operated, how the magazine worked, and also we show the bayonet that would be fitted on the end of the rifle. And in a controlled situation, we can hand this rifle around, allow people to operate it safely so they understand the feel and the weight of the type of rifles the soldiers carried in the First World War. The other item we show here is the 1908 cavalry sword, which I mentioned earlier. And this is showing the large, narrow, sharp blade that the cavalry sword had, as well as a special ergonomic grip designed for the right hand. So same thing, we explain how this sword was used in combat, and we'll hand it around to allow people to feel the weight of it and feel how the grip worked. So this is our Second World War room. It covers the period of the 1939 to 1945 Second World War. Our first panel is 1939-1940. Now this room was put together about 1992, so it needs some development. It will be renovated in the next year to the same standard as our First World War room. But this panel right now shows the mobilization of the unit. Again, we're cavalry part-time right up to the beginning of the Second World War, and then it was decided we were going to be mobilized as a tank regiment. The first task the soldiers had was some training in Shiloh. Then they moved to Red Rock, Ontario to guard German prisoners of war. They did this until the Veterans Guard, consisting of soldiers who were too old to serve in the Second World War but had served in the First, were formed in order to guard the prisoners, and then from there they moved on to Camp Borden for actual armored training. This is the khaki drill service dress worn in 1940 for training in Canada. This is a tropical uniform. It was worn with either long khaki pants or shorts. And the trooper here is wearing the brand new 1937 pattern belt of the new equipment they were starting to be issued at the beginning of the war. One of the weapons we have in the Second World War room is the famous Bren gun, developed in Czechoslovakia, adopted by Britain in the late 1930s. They were actually being manufactured in Canada for the British Army prior to the Second World War. So we were able to ramp up production and produce this very excellent machine gun for our own use as well as our allies in Britain. So this is the improved version of the Lee Enfield. We talked about the short magazine Lee Enfield of the First World War, which was in production until 1942, but only in Britain. Canada did not produce that weapon. However, an improved version was developed in the late 1930s, which became the No. 4 rifle. It was simplified manufacture, had a much smaller bayonet, a simple spike, and a whole different sighting system. These were produced in Canada, the USA, and in Great Britain in huge numbers. Over 1 million were produced here in Canada, and they were in use until very recently with the Canadian Rangers. This panel of 1940-41 covers our service in Borden as they were starting to train to become a full tank regiment. The problem was Canada only had a very few small training tanks bought from England in the late 30s, so we needed something to train on. So we arranged with the United States, who was neutral at the time, to ship some of their surplus First World War tanks, disarmed, because they couldn't actually ship us weapons under laws of neutrality, into Canada, so we had something to train on. So these were called the Model 1917 tank, based on a French design, and we used them initially for our training in Camp Borden. Okay. So in 1941, early 1941, the Fort Garry Horse head overseas once again, and they arrive in England in Aldershot, one of the big British training bases, where they continue in armored training with whatever tanks were available. The 1917 tanks were left in Canada, and they first adopted the American M3 tank, which we're now receiving through Lend-Lease. This is a relatively modern tank, however they're just used for driver training, and we only had 4 of them. By 1942-43, the Canadian Ram tank was in production. We started to be re-equipped with the Ram, which was going to be the tank we took into battle. However, the Ram couldn't be produced in large enough numbers, and once the United States got in the war, the Sherman tank became prevalent, and we were able to purchase those, and that was the tank that we used in combat. This is called the Sten gun. It was originally a very simple light submachine gun developed in Britain, and it was used by tank crews because having a rifle inside a tank, there's not much room. They initially tried equipping tank crews with pistols, and they found, of course, they didn't have enough power, so the Sten gun became sort of the standard sidearm when a soldier had to leave the tank and go on out in zone. Prior to the adoption of the Sten gun from 1942, Canadians for a submachine gun used the M1928 Thompson, 1928A1 model Thompson submachine gun. The one we have here is the M1 model, a little bit later, so it's not technically the version used by Canadians, but it gives you the general idea of the shape and layout of the Thompson submachine gun. So in 1944, in preparation for the invasion of Europe, 2 Canadian regiments, the Fort Garry Horse and the 1st Hussars from London, Ontario, were given the special task of using what was called the duplex drive tank. The duplex drive was a Sherman tank fitted with a canvas screen held up by rubber tubes filled with air that displaced enough water would allow the tank to float. It was moved forward in the water by 2 propellers and steered by a tiller or by the driver from inside under control from the commander standing on the roof of the tank. So we were one of, again, the 2 Canadian regiments to use these vehicles to allow us to swim ashore at the same time as a landing craft on D-Day. This mannequin is wearing a winter tank suit, sometimes called the Pixie suit, during 1944. He's also wearing the Armored Corps pattern helmet and the headset for his number 19 radio set. He's an officer. He has a set of binoculars, or a crew commander, as well as a pistol and pistol belt. So this panel covers our activities on D-Day, June 6, 1944. As I mentioned earlier, we're using the swimming duplex drive tanks. The Fort Garry Horse landed 3 squadrons, so each squadron with 20 tanks, 2 of them with a duplex drive, and 1 squadron fitted with wading tanks. So we covered 2 beaches, supporting the infantry inland, fought the battles of Carpiquet and the other areas in Normandy within the next few days, well into July, till the ends of the Battle of Normandy. And a lot of images here and firearms captured during that period. This is the German rifle of the Second World War. It was an improvement on the First World War rifle, making it shorter, improved sighting system, much like our Lee Enfield. This is the Carabiner 98K, K for Kurtz or short, and again, it was the standard sidearm, standard rifle of the German soldier. This is the machine pistol 44, or also the Sturmgewehr as it was known. One of the first things that we now call an assault rifle. In fact, the term assault rifle comes from the German Sturmgewehr. That's where we get that term. It was a simplified weapon, fired fully automatic, fired a shorter round than the normal 8mm Mauser, and was made of very simple stampings and very simple wood, so manufactured much quicker than the traditional Mauser rifles. This is the German 88mm Raketen Panzerbuchse 54, which is the also known as the Panzerschreck or Tank Terror in German. And this was an 88mm rocket that was electrically fired to be carried by one person. Very lightweight, simple metal tube. Used a hollow charge or a shaped charge in order to essentially melt a hole through the armor of the tank and explode on the inside. A very effective weapon, copied from the American bazooka, but greatly improved using a piezoelectric ignition system. Here we have in our 1944-45 Netherlands-Germany panel two German machine guns, the top one meaning the Maschinengewehr or MG42, developed as it comes in 1942. It was a simplified machine gun, much like the STG-44, was made of simple stampings, so it could be quickly and easily made, and also had looser tolerances, so it could operate in a lot of dirt, and particularly in cold weather on the Russian front. So this panel covers the end of the Second World War. So the Germans surrendered in May of 1945. The Garrys, as they'd done in the First World War, didn't come home right away. They moved necessarily into Holland, where they moved into the town of Dodecum, which they helped the local people rebuild their town and rebuild their lives, where they're still remembered to this day. In that town, there's actually a Fort Garry Horse Clubhouse, a local community club in this town in Holland. The pictures and images here show some of the last actions of the war, showing tanks coming through cities with cheering Dutch citizens welcoming their liberators. This is our tank ammunition display, and it shows the rapid advances in the size and nature of tank ammunition as tanks got larger and heavier and had much thicker armor. So the beginning of the Second World War, the best anti-tank guns were the American 37mm and the British 2-pounder. The very first two you see here, they're very quickly outclassed. It's replaced by the 6-pounder and the American 75mm, and that takes us into about 1942-43 when they become outclassed, and Britain adopted the 17-pounder and Americans adopted the 76mm as an anti-tank round based on the 75. The later rounds we show here are post-war ammunition, being the 20-pounder and the 105mm with the armor-piercing discarding sabot type of round. So this weapon is the M20 bazooka. As the German Panzerschreck was an improvement on the original American bazooka, the M20 is an improvement on the German Panzerschreck. So we took their design with the piezoelectric fuse or piezoelectric firing system, and that was used right up until the mid-1970s. The rockets here on display, you can see the wires hanging out the back. Those wires will be hooked up to the back of the launcher in order to provide the electric charge into the rear of the rocket to set it off. We hope you can come and visit our museum sometime. We're located at Lieutenant Colonel Harcus Strachan of VCMC Armoury in Winnipeg. That's located at 551 McRae Avenue. And we're open on Thursday evenings from 7:30 p.m. till 10 p.m. or we can be open for special appointments if you contact us. We have a website, fortgarryhorse.ca, which gives all the details.